You clicked because you've stood at that meat counter and felt it. The ribeye costs more than your whole dinner should, and something in your gut says this can't be the only good steak in the case. I felt it too, so I did something about it. I bought 9 of the cheapest steak cuts I could find, and I cooked them side by side against a ribeye, blind, over 3 weekends in my own kitchen. And here's what stopped me cold. 3 of those cheap cuts didn't just come close to the ribeye. They beat it. Flat out. And when I went looking for why nobody told me, the trail led straight into a research program that most people have never heard of, funded in a way that made my jaw drop. I remember standing in my kitchen at 11 at night, staring at a chuck-eye steak I'd paid $6 a pound for, thinking, this tastes exactly like the $18 cut. Exactly. And I couldn't stop asking myself one question. Why did no one ever say this out loud? By the end of this, I'll show you the one cut 2 universities identified in a laboratory back in 2002, a cut that was being ground into hamburger for 100 years before anyone bothered to name it. It's sitting in your grocery store right now, and you already own everything you need to cook it. Stay with me, because the last piece of this is the one the butchers kept for themselves. Let me take you back to that first steak, the chuck eye. If you've never bought one, you're not alone, because most stores barely stock them and most people walk right past. But here's the strange thing I noticed when I first cut into it. The grain, the marbling, the way the fat threaded through the meat, it looked like a ribeye that had been shrunk down a little. Not similar, nearly identical. So I went digging, and the reason turned out to be almost too simple. A ribeye comes from the rib section of the cow, specifically the 6th rib through the 12th. The chuck eye sits right next door, on the 5th rib. It is the exact same muscle, the longissimus dorsi, just one rib forward of where the label changes from cheap to expensive. One rib, that's the entire difference. Cross an invisible line on the animal and the price nearly triples. But there's a catch, and it's the reason this stayed a secret for so long. There are only about 2 of these steaks on each side of the cow, maybe 4 good ones per animal, total. They're rare, so stores don't build displays around them, and butchers historically just toss that whole section into the chuck, the stew meat pile, the grinder. For 100 years, one of the best tasting steaks on the cow was going into ground beef because it wasn't worth the counter space to separate 2 little steaks. I fried mine in a cast iron pan with nothing but salt, the same way I did the ribeye. Blind taste, my wife judging. She picked the chuck eye as the ribeye, twice, at $6 a pound against $18, and that's when the real question hit me. If the difference between a cheap steak and a premium one can come down to a single rib and a marketing label, then who decided which cuts got the glory and who profited from the rest of the cow being called second rate, because somebody did decide. This didn't happen by accident. Here's what I found, and it changed how I look at that entire meat case. For most of American history, the cuts we treat as royalty, the ribeye, the tenderloin, the New York strip, earned that status for one reason. They came from the muscles along the back of the cow that don't do much work. Less work means more tender. Simple enough. So the back cuts became steaks, and everything from the shoulder and the leg, the chuck and the round got labeled tough, cheap, roast and stew meat. Grind it, braise it, boil it, that was the rule for 100 years. But that rule was based on the whole shoulder being lumped together as one thing. Nobody had ever actually gone in muscle by muscle and tested each individual one. They just assumed the shoulder was tough because parts of it were, and they wrote off the entire region. Millions of pounds of good steak, dismissed by association. And who benefited from that? Follow it with me. When the shoulder and leg get sold as cheap ground beef and stew meat, the packers still move the product, but the money, the margin, the prestige, all of it concentrates on a handful of back cuts. So the whole marketing machine of the American beef industry got built around convincing you that steak means ribeye, strip, and fillet. Everything else was a lesser animal. You were trained to reach for the expensive third of the cow and ignore the rest. I'm not saying anyone sat in a dark room plotting against your dinner. I'm saying the incentives ran one direction for 100 years, and nobody had a reason to look closer. Until, finally, somebody did. And what they found is the part they never put on a billboard. Now here's where the trail gets good. In the late 1990s, American beef was in trouble. People were buying less of it, chicken was eating its lunch, and the cattle industry was watching the middle of the cow, the chuck, and the round. More than half the animals sell for grinding prices, while pork and poultry ate up the dinner plate. So the beef industry did something they'd never seriously done before. They funded actual science to find out whether all that cheap meat was really as worthless as everyone assumed. The money came from something called the beef checkoff. And when I learned how it works, I understood why this research even happened. Since a 1985 federal law, the Beef Promotion and Research Act, every time a cow is sold in America, $1 per head gets collected into a national fund. Cattle ranchers pay it whether they want to or not. That pool of money runs the Beef, It's What's for Dinner campaign, and it also paid for the study I'm about to describe. Around 2000, researchers at the University of Nebraska and the University of Florida launched what they called the Beef Muscle Profiling Study. The lead meat scientist at Nebraska was a man named Dr. Chris Calkins, and his team did something almost nobody had done in the whole history of the American beef business. They took the chuck and the round apart, one muscle at a time, 39 separate muscles, and they measured each one. Tenderness with a machine called a Warner-Bratzler shear, which literally measures the force in pounds it takes to cut through the cooked meat. Flavor, marbling, every muscle, on its own, judged on its own merits, instead of lumped in with its neighbors. And what they found buried in the shoulder embarrassed 100 years of assumptions. There was a muscle in the chuck, the shoulder, that measured as the second most tender muscle in the entire cow, second only to the tenderloin, the cut that gives you filet mignon and sells for the highest price in the store, second most tender out of the whole animal, and it had been going into the grinder for a century, sold as hamburger. They called it the flat iron steak. Before that study, it essentially did not exist as a steak you could buy. Its formal introduction to the market came in 2002. That's not ancient history, that's a steak younger than a lot of people's phones. And it exists on your grocery shelf today only because a group of scientists finally bothered to test a muscle everyone had already written off. I bought a flat iron for $8 a pound. I did the same blind test. Cast iron, salt, medium rare, rested. And I'll be honest with you, it wasn't quite as rich as the ribeye. The ribeye still won on pure fatty flavor, but on tenderness, the flat iron walked all over it. Buttery, clean, and when I did the math on cost per bite of enjoyment, it wasn't close. I was paying more than double for a marginal upgrade in fat and giving up tenderness to do it. But the flat iron wasn't even the cut that shocked me most, because in that same study, sitting right beside it in the shoulder, was another muscle, and this one had a story that made me put down my notes. Let me tell you about the teres major. If the flat iron was hiding in plain sight, the teres major was practically in witness protection. It's a small muscle in the shoulder, sometimes called the shoulder tender, sometimes the petite tender, sometimes the bistro tender. In that same Nebraska profiling work, it tasked it as one of the most tender muscles in the entire cow, right up near the tenderloin again. 2 of the 3 tenderest muscles on the animal were both hiding in the cheap shoulder the whole time. Here's why you've probably never seen it. The teres major is tucked underneath the shoulder blade, wrapped in connective tissue in an awkward spot. To cut it out clean, a butcher has to know exactly where it is and take the time to separate it by hand. It takes skill, and a few minutes per animal. So for a century, instead of doing that work, they just threw the whole chunk into the grinder with everything else. Not because it was bad, because it was inconvenient. The tenderest hamburger you ever ate was probably this muscle. This is exactly the kind of hidden pattern I've spent years chasing across the whole kitchen, not just the meat counter. I put everything I've found on cuts like this, plus the cooking methods that make cheap food taste expensive, into a digital book called Meat Smart and its companion Deep Frugal, both part of what I call the full system. You'll find them linked in the description if you want the full breakdown at your own pace. For now, let's stay on this trail, because the name they finally gave that muscle is where things get interesting. I had to special order mine, and it ran about $9 a pound. It came out looking like a little tenderloin, a long, narrow log of deep red meat. I seared it whole and sliced it into medallions. And this is the one that ended the argument in my house. It was so tender you could cut it with the side of a fork. My wife asked me where I'd hidden the filet mignon. When I told her it cost $9 a pound instead of the $24 the filet was going for that week, she didn't believe me until I showed her the receipt. Second tenderest muscle in the whole animal, costing barely a third of the cut it rivals. Hidden for 100 years, because it was a little annoying to trim. Now I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now, because I thought it too. You're thinking, that's fine for a fellow with a good knife and a real butcher and a fancy pan, but I can't find these cuts, and I don't know how to cook a strange piece of meat without ruining it. I hear you. I was standing right where you are 6 weeks ago. So let me stop and hand you something you can actually use this week with the kitchen you already have. First, the finding. You do not need a single special tool. Every one of these cuts, I cooked in an ordinary cast iron skillet, the same heavy pan half of you already have sitting on the stove, the one that belonged to your mother. No sous vide machine, no grill, no thermometer, even though one helps. If you can heat a pan until it's smoking hot and put salt on meat, you have every skill this requires. Second, how to actually find them. You will rarely see the words Teres Major or flat iron printed on a package, and that's part of why they stayed invisible. But your store's meat department cuts these from the chuck, which they carry every single day. Walk up to the counter, the real counter, with a person behind it and say these exact words. Can you cut me a chuck-eye steak, and do you have any shoulder tender or flat iron in the back? 9 times out of 10, the meat cutter knows exactly what you mean, and half the time they'll tell you it's what they take home themselves. That sentence is worth about $10 a pound to you every time you use it. Third, the one technique that turns any of these into something better than a restaurant. Salt them early, not right before cooking early. Take your steak out, pat it bone dry with a paper towel, and salt it generously on both sides at least 40 minutes before it hits the pan, and if you can, leave it uncovered in the fridge overnight. What happens is simple. At first the salt pulls moisture to the surface, then that moisture dissolves the salt and gets drawn back into the meat, seasoning it all the way through and breaking down the protein so it holds its juices when it cooks. This is the single biggest difference between a cheap cut that tastes cheap and a cheap cut that tastes like money. It costs nothing. It's just time and a little salt you already own. Get your pan screaming hot. A film of oil with a high smoke point. Lay the steak down and don't touch it. Let it build a dark brown crust, 2 to 3 minutes, then flip. For the thin cuts like flat iron, that's nearly it. For the thicker ones, pull them off at 130 degrees for medium rare, and this is the part people skip. Let them rest on the counter a full 10 minutes before you cut. Cutting too early dumps all the juice onto your board. And here's the rule that matters most for every one of these shoulder cuts. Slice against the grain. Look at the lines running through the meat and cut across them, not along them. Do that. And even a cut with a reputation for being chewy turns tender in your mouth. Do it wrong, and you'll blame the steak for your knife. That's it. Hot pan, early salt, rest it, slice across the grain. 4 things, all free, all with what's in your kitchen tonight. I promise you can do this. But I told you at the start, there was one more piece, the one they kept for themselves. And this is where the whole investigation finally closed for me. While I was reading through the old butchering trade material and the muscle profiling documents, one cut kept coming up with a nickname that stuck out, the hanger steak. In the old shops, they called it the butcher's steak, And when I found out why, it told me everything about what really happened to all this hidden beef. The hanger is a single muscle that hangs off the diaphragm deep inside the cow. There's only one per animal, no pair, just one. It's got a bold, almost mineral beefy flavor that a lot of chefs will tell you beats the ribeye for pure taste. But here is the part that stopped me. For generations, butchers didn't sell it. When they broke down the carcass, they quietly set that one muscle aside and took it home for their own families. The customers out front never even knew it existed. That's how it earned the name, the butcher's steak. The cut so good, the man cutting the meat kept it off the counter and out of your sight. Think about what that means. The people who knew the most about meat, who saw every cut of every animal, all day, every day, looked at the whole cow and chose that hidden, cheap, unglamorous muscle for their own dinner table. Not the ribeye they were selling you for a premium, the one they didn't even bother to price, because they were keeping it. And that was the answer to the question I'd been chasing since that night in my kitchen. It was never that the cheap cuts were worse. It's that the best value on the animal kept quietly disappearing into the grinder because separating it was inconvenient, into marketing because the money lived on 3 back cuts, and into the butcher's own kitchen because he knew exactly what he had. The knowledge existed the whole time, it just never made it to you. So here's your finale, the thing you can do this weekend. Go find a hanger steak, ask for it by name, or by butcher steak. And if your counterman is any good, he'll grin when you say it. It'll run you somewhere around $8 to $10 a pound against the ribeye's $18. Give it the salt treatment overnight. Sear it hard and fast in that cast iron, because it's a thin cut and it cooks quick. Pull it at medium rare. No further, this one gets tough if you overcook it. Rest it 10 minutes. Then slice it thin across the grain and taste what the people who cut the meat kept for themselves for 100 years while they sold you the expensive stuff up front. I did exactly that on the last weekend of my little experiment, and of the 9 cheap cuts I tested, 3 of them genuinely beat that ribeye once I accounted for what I paid the chuck eye that's the same muscle 1 rib over, the flat iron that a laboratory pulled out of the hamburger pile in 2002, and the teres major that's the second most tender bite on the entire animal. The hanger came in right behind them, and it's the one I'll reach for first from now on, because it tastes like a secret somebody was keeping. Here's what I keep coming back to. Nobody stole anything from you at gunpoint. They just let you believe that good steak had to be expensive steak, and they let the best value on the cow slip past you your whole life into the grinder, into the ad campaigns, into somebody else's kitchen. And it took a taxpayer-adjacent research fund and 2 universities to finally write down what a few honest butchers already knew. If you're the kind of person who's always suspected that the premium version of things is mostly a story told by whoever profits from you buying it, you're not paranoid, you just paid attention. That instinct that made you click on this video is the same instinct that's going to save you real money at that meat counter for the rest of your life. Now I want to hear from you, and I mean this, leave me a comment. Have you ever bought a chuck eye steak or asked your butcher for the shoulder tender? And if you did it fool your family the way it fooled mine? And tell me this too. Is there a butcher's counter still standing near you, or did your town lose it to the shrink-wrap shelf like so many did? Tell me where you're watching from. I read these and I'm building the next list from what you send me. If any part of this made you look at that meat case differently, follow along with me, because this channel is a group of us quietly walking the trail back to the simple, honest methods that got buried so somebody else could sell us the expensive version. We're not customers, we're people taking the knowledge back. And next time, I'm pulling the thread on something in your own kitchen that's even bigger than steak. I found a document that says the sell-by date on the food in your refrigerator right now was never about your safety at all. And once you see who it was really designed to protect, you'll never throw food away the same way again. I'll see you there. Before you go, one thing. This video gave you the overview, but inside the Old Ways Society I hand you the full cut-by-cut map, every knife line and pan technique. And if you get stuck, you ask me right there, and a real person answers you. You won't be alone. Old ways folks like you are already in there with me. Just point your phone's camera at the code on screen, and you can cancel any time. Now, before you spend another dollar on ribeye, let me show you the one $5 cut a veteran butcher swears by. It's tender, it's cheap, and that video's starting right here.